So today I want to try and cover the best part of 1,700 years of history of the church in the East. And that might not sound fair given that I've spent 25 sessions largely in the Roman Empire and only covered 451 years. But the reality is that we know much less of history of Christianity in the East and their churches than we do churches based in Europe. There's been much lost in translation having not taken place, and much more has simply been lost to devastation and persecution and time. And I must admit that this Church of the East is not my area of expertise, although of course I have definitely done my homework on it. Now, the Church of the East, also known unhelpfully as the Nestorian Church, broke away completely and officially from Christianity in the Roman Empire after the Council of Ephesus in 431, which deposed and rejected Nestorius and his theology, which the Church of the East continued to uphold, and Nestorius is regarded as a saint in the Church of the East even to this day. But in truth, it had already distanced itself somewhat from the church in the Roman Empire before the Council of Ephesus and this big fallout with Nestorius. It had already declared itself independent, with its head bishop being based where this big red dot here is, in the middle of Iraq, modern day Iraq, which was the capital of the Sassanid Empire, called Ctesiphon Seleucia, basically modern day Baghdad. So they'd already declared themselves independent and moved their primary bishop, their patriarch, to there. And it had done this for primarily political reasons. Rome and the Sassanid Empire were the two major world powers in this area, and they were constantly at war. Now, the church had already expanded beyond the confines of the Sassanid Empire at this point. They were along the Malabar coast, as it is known, of India, churches established by the Apostle Thomas himself, and they had also, from what we understand in one record, at least by 330 AD, reached Ceres, or northern China as we would call it today. But outside of Iran, Iraq, the central Sassanid Empire, and the churches in India, there doesn't seem to have been a settled presence east towards China and Central Asia. Now, as we said, the church in the East broke away because they agreed with Nestorius, and they prefer to keep the language of two natures of Christ, the human and divine, being separate quite clearly, not united as one. And they couldn't abide the language of Mother of God for Mary, or God suffered, or God died. And when Nestorius was condemned as a heretic, this was an opportunity to fully break with the West. And the history of the church in the East becomes largely unknown and untold in the West. But it is a history of stunning missionary work and unbelievable tenacity in the face of unconscionable persecution. The history of the church largely moves in 5 phases: the Sassanid era, the Islamic conquests, the Mongol era, the Colonial era, and finally the modern era. And we'll work through these together and then bring it all to a close with some reflection. So, the Sassanid Empire, if this is modern day Turkey, and this is the Mediterranean Sea, the Byzantine Empire was largely based here. The Roman Empire was Europe and the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The Sassanid Empire was all of this region kind of round here, at times conquering right into Turkey and even taking control down into Egypt. Their capital was in the middle of modern day Iraq. So, The Sassanid Empire was explicitly Zoroastrian, a unique faith, largely dead today, but still hanging on in a few places. And from the start, they had held Christians with suspicion. And Christians who lived within the Sassanid Empire had undergone severe persecutions at various points in the first 300 years or so, as they did in the Roman Empire as well. There were countless martyrdoms. But the breakaway Church of the East was recognised as an official state religion within the Sassanid Empire in 410. In 424, as I mentioned, they broke away from the West structurally and said they would no longer be subject to outside theologians and bishops. They moved their patriarch to modern-day Baghdad, essentially. And they didn't attend the Council of Ephesus because of this, where Nestorius was condemned. Now, the emperor of the Sassanid Empire, seeing the Christians in his land siding with this Nestorius, who was condemned in the Roman Empire, gave his protection and favour to the Nestorian Christians and started persecuting the pro-Western Christians, thereby gaining the favour of the Christians of the church in the East. But this wouldn't last, and persecution would continue to break out time and time again. There were occasional schisms and splits in the church, but then it would unite again over politics and power. Severe persecution, though, did return in the early 6th century due to renewed conflict and war with the Roman Byzantine Empire. Nonetheless, the church continued to expand. From being based mainly here, the church became well established in the Lakhmid kingdom along the northern coast of modern-day Saudi Arabia. And it also connected up towards India, so it began to spread in this direction as it went. At the start of the 7th century, so the early 600s, the theologian Babai the Great codified the theology of the Church of the East in a way which talked about how Christ was fully God and fully man. And his language was very similar to that adopted in the West at the Council of Chalcedon, although it used Syrian words. He said that Jesus had two essences or two natures united in one person. However, what is important is that he also codified the absolute rejection of language which spoke about God being born of Mary, spoke about God suffering, or God dying on the cross. And that would continue to cause major issues with the West if ever conversations were to take place. Now, by the year 650 AD, so we're advancing quite a bit in time so far, there's a major river here which was known as the Oxus River. It kind of spreads from Pakistan, North India, up through Afghanistan and into the Central Asian plain. By 650, there were 20 dioceses east of the Oxus River. But here is where something major takes place, which only accelerates this expansion to the east. The rise of Islam. The modern Muslim Arabs who came from down here in the south of Saudi Arabia, they expanded up and they conquered the Sassanid Empire, which was weakened by centuries of war with Rome in 644 AD. Now, when they conquered the Sassanid Empire, the heartlands of the Church of the East, they didn't kill the Christians. They were people of the book, like the Jews, but they were forbidding them from spreading the faith to Muslims, and they also had to pay a protection tax. But the missionary fervour of the Church of the East was such that, well, if we can't evangelise at home, we'll have to do it going abroad. Of course, the other factor which this brought with the conquest of Islam was that all contact with the West was essentially destroyed at this point. But new horizons were soon to be met. Missionaries connected downwards fully establishing relations with India and also Sri Lanka, bringing these Christians who had been there since the beginning into the proper hierarchy and fold and bishop structure of the Church of the East. Also, they began to spread the faith along the Silk Road, and they headed all the way to the capital of China, where in 635 the missionary Alopen gained official support in the Chinese imperial court and palace to spread the faith of Christianity throughout China. From there it also spread to places like Tibet. Significantly, the faith didn't only spread to the east, it also spread to the north, to modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Caucasus Mountains. It was also at this time, I should mention also, it spread towards Egypt and back into the Roman Empire, which was also being conquered by the Muslims as they continued. Now, this era of missionary expansion would come to an end in 845 AD, when Emperor Wuzong spread his anti-Buddhist persecution to also include Christianity and Zoroastrianism. These were seen as foreign religious influences to be banished from China. And this persecution in China was brutal and it was absolute, with churches and monasteries being burnt and destroyed, being seized and melted down, anything that was gold or precious. And by the turn of the millennium, 1000 AD, there was very little Christianity left in China. We know from some gravestones that it did hang on. It hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had largely disappeared as an organised religion. Unable to spread the faith in their heartlands of Iran and Iraq due to Islam, and crushed in China, things began to seem bleak for the Church of the East. But that would change once again as the focus of missionary endeavour simply led to the faith spreading elsewhere. Around the 9th century, there had been mass conversions among the steppe tribes, such as the Turkic Kipchaks. In 1007 AD, 200,000 Turks and Mongols converted. That's right, Mongols became Christians. The Kipchak Turkic tribes, north of modern-day Georgia, kind of in this area of southern Russia, they even adopted Christianity as their official natural religion, and Christianity spread to Mongolia and the Mongol tribes there, where many tribes converted to Christianity, foremost among them the Naiman, the Merkit, the Ongud and the Karaite Mongol clans. Now, many Christians were therefore present when a certain man named Temujin became Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan's sons were married to Christian women from the Karaite clan. And of course this led to Christians having significant influence inside the Mongol court. Indeed, it could be argued quite convincingly that Christianity was the single most influential religion under the time of Genghis Khan's grandson. In 1271, the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty. And this led to Christianity once again becoming prominent in China. The Church of the East would reach its greatest extent around this time. By the end of the 13th century, the late 1200s, the Church of the East had approximately 7 to 8 million members. That's about 2 to 3% of the entire world population. It's at this time, if we look at this map, that all of these red dots I've placed, stretching from Alexandria in Cyprus to southern Arabia, based lots around still this central area of Iran and Iraq, all along the Malabar coast and up the other side, Sri Lanka, across all the Turkic areas and central tribes, and all the way through China, all the way down the east coast and south coast of China. All of those dots represent churches or bishoprics where bishops were based, or archaeological finds of monasteries of the Church of the East. This is an enormous church, thriving church. But all of that would come to an end with the end of the Mongol era. It would come crashing down in the 14th century, and the Church of the East would enter near irreparable decline. So what happened? Well, the Mongols, heavily influenced by Christians, who started the Yuan dynasty, quickly became like those whom they ruled. They became like Chinese people. They adopted Chinese customs and thinking and religion and practice. And Christianity was not popular among many Buddhist sects because Christian monasteries were more popular than Christian temples in some areas. And they complained to the Mongol emperors, who had become more and more Chinese in their way of thinking. And so, in the early 1300s, persecution began. In 1368, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty in China, was overthrown by the Ming dynasty. And the Ming dynasty was incredibly xenophobic. They sought to eject and cast out of China all foreign influences. And while Islam and Jews were allowed to remain legal, Christianity was not. Both the Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church, which had been sending missionaries along the Silk Road for a number of years, causing all kinds of strife and infighting among Christians at the time, both of these churches were banned. The Church of the East had all of its possessions taken from them, their churches were destroyed, their monasteries were destroyed, and Christians were forcibly expelled beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. In the Middle East, the heartlands, Iran, Iraq, the power vacuum that was left after the Mongol invasions meant that Christians were at the whim of local warlords and bandits and persecuted in that way. And then came a man called Tamerlane. Now, Tamerlane was a military genius. He was a militant Muslim. And from 1370 to 1405, he vastly expanded his empire to include all of this area round here, modern-day Iran, Iraq, modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of this area. He took it over. And as he did so, he killed every single Christian that his forces could find. It was an enormous genocide. And then came the Black Death, and what few Christians remained, well, many of them were also lost. The Church of the East shrank immensely from all of these red dots to only the churches along the coast of India and Sri Lanka, where Tamerlane never reached, and some holdouts here in northeastern Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, in the mountains of the Caucasus. In 1450, the church was in such a poor state, so separated and broken, that the patriarch in charge felt that he simply had to make his position as patriarch, head of the church, hereditary, passed from uncle to nephew through the generations, something which continued until 1973. And so ended the era of the Mongols. Next came the era of colonialism. Now, as Europe entered the Enlightenment and had its Reformation and began colonization in the 1500s, there were major schisms within the Church of the East and what remained of it. Rome and Protestants would come to have a huge impact also in the Church of the East. And we will deal separately now with the Assyrian Church, which remained in northern Iraq, northeastern Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia area, the Assyrian Church, and the churches in India. Vastly separated, hardly able to communicate, but both part of the Church of the East. Let's deal with them separately in this era of colonialism. By the mid-16th century, the 1550s or so, the hereditary nature of the succession of the patriarch led, unsurprisingly, to major issues, fallouts and power struggles between various families. In 1552, a man named Sulaka sought to support his claim to the throne by petitioning Franciscan Roman Catholic missionaries to support him. And these Franciscan missionaries, they sent him to Rome to meet with the Pope. And there, after a bit of debate, he signed a profession of faith acceptable to the Pope, and the Pope consecrated him Patriarch of the Church of the Chaldeans of Mosul. Pope Julius III created a new church. Now, the Ottoman Empire authorities, they recognised this man as he continued his journey back, and when he reached Mosul, kind of in modern-day Iraq, he appointed new bishops. He started his own church. Ironically, this Roman Catholic aligned breakaway church would also eventually become hereditary, passing on from generation to generation its top bishop. Throughout the next few centuries, various other groups would break away from the Assyrian Church and join the Roman Catholic Church. In the 18th century, many traditionalists also converted over, as well as another schism took place. The Roman Catholic aligned branch of the Church of the East is now known as the Chaldean Catholic Church. Now, despite further genocides, such as the one by Kurdish warlords in 1843, which led to 10,000 Christians being killed, the traditional ancient Church of the East continued in that form as what is known as the Assyrian Church of the East. It faced even worse persecution, as did other Roman Catholic associated churches, during the Ottoman-led Assyrian genocide, which killed 200 to 400,000 Assyrian Christians between 1914 and 1921. A terrible genocide, barely recognised in the international community. The Assyrian Church of the East now has its patriarch based in Chicago in the United States, ever since anti-Christian, anti-Assyrian massacres in 1933 in Iraq, where 6,000 people were killed. In 2010, there were around 170,000 members of the Assyrian Church of the East worldwide, but the rise of the Islamic State has devastated congregations since then, which remained in Iraq and Syria. Perhaps the most significant thing, though, for the Assyrian Church of the East, the northern part of this ancient Nestorian church, as it were, was that in 1994, the Roman Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East agreed a joint statement on Christology, on how God was both man and God in Jesus Christ. They agreed that he had two natures in one person, and most significantly, huge breakthrough, the Church of the East agreed and recognised the validity of the language of Mary being the Mother of God, the issue which first caused the Nestorian Schism in the first place. And although they don't use that language themselves, they finally recognise that that is true and valid language. Throughout the 1900s, they also adopted the Western Gregorian calendar for doing their dates and dating their festivals. They shortened their observance of Lent, and they reformed some aspects of their liturgy. And those kind of reforms actually led to a breakaway church forming in 1968, known as the Ancient Church of the East, which is based in Baghdad and not in Chicago. So, that is the Assyrian Church, the northern part of this ancient Church of the East. What of India? What was happening there? Well, things are very, very complicated these days, with at least 8 what's known as St. Thomas Christian churches being in existence. And these are churches which claim they date back to the time of the Apostle Thomas. And these 8 different churches have affiliations to the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, the Assyrian Church of the East, but also the Protestants, the Roman Catholics, and the Oriental Orthodox Churches. So, what happened in India? Well, as I mentioned, India was spared the ravages of Tamerlane, but problems soon began nonetheless when the Portuguese arrived in 1498. The Portuguese arrived and they found Christians, but they wouldn't accept that they were truly Christian. At best, they were heretics. At worst, they were pagans, because they accepted the caste system of untouchables and different castes of people, which was common throughout Hinduism and the Indian subcontinent. And so they began subjugating these local Christians, forcing them to be Roman Catholic. I mentioned that there was a big schism in the Church of the East in 1552 when a bishop from Iraq went to the Pope and became a new archbishop and went back and started a Roman Catholic aligned church in the East. Well, when that happened, it gave the Portuguese the excuse they needed. They stopped any contact happening between the Assyrian Church and the Indian Church. They instigated their own Roman Catholic aligned bishops, and they forced the churches to become Roman Catholic. When the highest ranking local traditional minister died in 1599, the Portuguese convened what is known as the Synod of Diampa. And at this point, all the Christians were forced to be Roman Catholic. It was outlawed that you could accept the Hindu caste system. Local church customs were changed. The Syriac version of the Bible was burned. Various other theological books were burned, and the use of the historic traditional liturgy of the Church of the East was outlawed. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't go down well with the local Christians who had been there for 1,500 years, and anti-Portuguese sentiment due to this heavy-handed persecution grew and grew. And then there was this charismatic Christian figure called Anaphala, and he appeared, and then he was saying that he was the true representative and he would lead the church, and then the Portuguese captured him and imprisoned him and said they took him away to see the Pope, but everyone believes that actually the Portuguese simply murdered him. And the local Christians at this point had had enough. They gathered around a large outside crucifix called the Cunan Cross. And then there was the Cunan Cross Revolt, where they rebelled against the Jesuits and the Portuguese, and they broke off away from the Roman Catholic Church, which had been oppressing them. 12 local ministers laid their hands on an archdeacon and appointed him to be their bishop. And thus began the Malankara Church, which isn't recognised by those who stayed loyal to Rome, which is known as the Syro-Malabar Church. So many different church names that sound so similar. Well, this new bishop of the Malankara Church, he sought wider support and international recognition. He couldn't get in touch with the Church of the East, which was tiny and dwindling anyway, so he got in touch with the Oriental Orthodox Churches. Those we're going to speak about next week, the Copts, the Ethiopians, and the Jacobite Syrian Orthodox Church based in Antioch. And these churches came together and they recognised this bishop as one of their own and said, you can be part of the Oriental Orthodox Churches. And so then in India we had 3 different St. Thomas Christian churches. You had the traditionalists who still stayed loyal to the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church. You had the Roman Catholic aligned church, and you had the Oriental Orthodox Church. The church which stayed loyal to the Church of the East, to the Assyrian Church, is known as the Chaldean Syrian Church in Kerala. Quite a mouthful, and not to be confused with the Chaldean Church, which is Roman Catholic based around Iran and Iraq. So, Roman Catholic, Church of the East, Oriental Orthodox, And further issues come when the British take over India and bring with it Reformed Protestant Anglicanism and the Church Mission Society. The Church Mission Society, CMS, had very good relations at first with the Oriental Orthodox Church, and they were quite positive. They taught in the seminaries of these Indian churches. But soon, some of the Indian believers were thinking, we like the idea that actually the Bible is the final authority by which everything must be judged. We agree that justification by faith alone is in the Bible and is what we must believe, that this is the gospel, that purgatory and all these other things are not found in the Bible. And so they agitated and they called for a reformation of the church in India, just as there had been a reformation all those centuries ago back in Europe. And so this led to the creation of the Church of South India, an Anglican affiliated church. But a bit later there would be yet more calls for reform within the Indian church. And so you would have another split away from the Oriental Orthodox Church and the establishment of the Mar Thoma Syrian Church. Now there is a St. Thomas Christian Protestant Church. Now, there's been various other splits between the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic aligned churches and the Protestant churches in India over the past 100 years, which has led to a confused mess of Thomas Christian churches. There's two main Protestant ones, there's two main Roman Catholic ones using different liturgies, different language and having different bishops. There's three Oriental Orthodox ones. And of course, there's the church we started this session off with, the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church. So, that's India. As we close, let's consider the Church of the East and how it went from its immense size and scope, the chief driver of world mission and evangelism, to a relatively tiny church based in India, where it's a significant minority among the St. Thomas Christian churches, and in the Middle East, where again it's a tiny minority with many of its people living abroad, particularly in the United States, where its bishop, of course, is based in Chicago. Now, there's a fantastic book called The Church of the East, an Illustrated History of Assyrian Christianity by Christoph Baumer. Absolutely fantastic book. Many different images of various different Christian things, including on the back there is a Chinese Christian monastery dating to an Nestorian era. And Christoph Baumer, towards the end, he lists a number of reasons for a decline of the Church of the East, which are worth pondering today. So I want to give his reasons for its decline to such a small Christian group now. There's 9 external reasons. 9 external reasons. Number 1, the isolation of the Church of the East from its sister churches in the West and from itself because of the vast distances between the east coast of China and Iraq and India and these kind of places. It made communication difficult for unity. Except in the Middle East, the church remained a tiny proportion of the surrounding population, which meant it always stayed as a minority religion, very much at the whim and behest of higher powers. Number 3, it never really became a state religion with all the advantages and protections that brought to the churches in the Roman Empire. Number 4, the religions of Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism were so well established and tied into a very fabric of culture and national and personal identity that being a Christian always meant in some sense being foreign and other. Number 5, times of severe persecution and often hundreds of year spans of low-level pressure and persecution to abandon the faith. Number 6, an increasingly insular focus leading to tribal thinking and the Christians becoming a ghetto among the surrounding nations. Very much, if you were a Syrian as an ethnicity, you were a Christian. If you were a certain ethnicity from the Indian coast, you were Christian. But that isn't a good and healthy place for the church to be. Number 7, leading to the decline from outside, was the work of Protestant and Roman Catholic missionaries, who led to great divisions and splits and who converted many of the Church of the East Christians. Number 8 was 2 major periods of genocide. One under Tamerlane, and secondly under the Ottomans and Kurds of the early 20th century. And number 9, of course, is Islam being an intolerant and culture-confining religion. There's also 3 internal factors that have led to the decline of the Church of the East. Number 1 is the fact that they generally focused and were based in the ruling educated classes of the places where they were. By and large, but not entirely, they didn't create mass conversions in the general population, which meant that when ruling parties changed, things quickly could go south. They never had popular support. There were a number of internal schisms and conflicts that highly weakened the church. And finally, more recently, is the death of monasticism and a culture of prayer and devotion uniting the churches together. So, in these 12 factors are a great wealth of things, many of which are worth pondering for today, our own situation at home in a changing culture increasingly hostile to Christianity, where we are in a minority, and many would say continue to really be a religion of the upper wealthier classes, and abroad as we continue to try and spread the faith of Lord Jesus Christ to lands where churches once flourished, such as China and the Far East, India, and of course the Middle East. Much to consider there. So that is the Church of the East. A little told tale full of martyrdom, tenacity, and above all else, incredible missionary fervour. Would we learn and consider much from all that they offer? Next week we'll consider the Oriental Orthodox Churches based in Egypt and Ethiopia, and also around Antioch in Syria. Another fascinating group of Christians who at the end have also come close once again to uniting Christendom together.